Does the Bible say abortion is murder? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Let's take a look at a video, and just so you're aware, I've muted the first part because it has some copyrighted music in it.
If I had a nickel for every time I had to respond to Genesis 2:7, I sure as heck wouldn't be doing this. Well, that's a lie. I'd still be doing it, but you get my point.
All right, let's see it.
So Genesis 2:7 never mentions that life begins at first breath. It says that God made Adam from dust and breathed life into him. There's nowhere in the Bible that says life begins at first breath.
So the argument here seems to be that you're not allowed to appeal to Genesis 2:7 as an indication that the biblical authors understood life to begin at first breath, because Genesis 2:7 does not explicitly state, quote, life begins at first breath, unquote, which would seem to suggest that we're not allowed to draw conclusions about the worldviews and ideologies of biblical authors unless they explicitly state exactly the conclusion we're trying to draw. But that's not how biblical exegesis works. And when we look at the entire Hebrew Bible, at least up until the Greco-Roman period, what we see is that unilaterally, breath is fundamentally constitutive of life. In other words, breath is the single, fundamental, essential element of life. And this is found not only in Genesis 2:7's representation of the first living being created through the combination of soil and breath, but also in the reference to the breath of life being snuffed out of all living beings with the flood, and references to death being a function of the removal of breath. So, for instance, in Psalm 104:29, God takes their breath away, they die. Or Ecclesiastes 3:19, where it says that humans don't have any special status over animals. As one dies, so another dies. They all have the same breath. But we also have the words for life in the Hebrew Bible. Chaim is the most basic one, but there are two others that are used just as frequently to mean life and are just as frequently translated life into English. One of them is ruach and the other is nefesh, both of which fundamentally mean breath. In fact, people are fond of pointing to Leviticus 17 and saying, no, the life is in the blood. But in addition to the fact that that chapter is entirely and exclusively prohibiting the eating of animal blood, the word for life is nefesh, breath. So breath is fundamentally constitutive of life throughout the entire Hebrew Bible up until the Greco-Roman period. And what changed there? Well, Greek philosophy showed up and changed how Greco-Roman Judaism perceived the beginning of the person, not necessarily human life, although sometimes human life and personhood are coextensive, but they also can refer to different things. But with the influx of Greek philosophy, there were debates about when human life, or more precisely, personhood, began. And there were three main schools. According to the Stoics, it didn't begin until birth. According to the Aristotelians, it began when the fetus was fully formed, more or less in association with the quickening, when the mother can perceive the independent movement of the fetus. And then you had the Epicureans and the Pythagoreans, who thought it began at conception. And this debate contributed to how early Christians understood abortion. The Pythagorean/Epicurean position was probably the dominant view until we get to the 4th or the 5th centuries CE, when it shifted to the Aristotelian view, and that became the consensus from Augustine all the way down into the 19th century.
Exodus 21:22, on the other hand, is a different story. It's probably one of the best verses that the pro-choice movement can use if they're going to try to use the Bible to justify their killing of children. It says that if two men are fighting and he accidentally strikes the other man's woman and she ends up having a miscarriage, then he should be fined. It goes on to say that if the woman is damaged even more, then it's answered with eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Now, that's not the only reading of the text. There are some people that argue that it's not talking about a miscarriage, it's talking about a premature birth.
And those people are wrong, and I go into a detailed discussion about why in chapter 7 of my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, what we get right and wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues. And chapter 7 addresses the claim that the Bible says abortion is murder.
Now, I do grant the scholarly consensus points to a miscarriage, but there is still that other option there. Now, here's the thing. Even if I do grant that latter viewpoint, it still doesn't permit abortion. As a matter of fact, it would still condemn it. It says that if it was to happen, that there should be a consequence. The man should be fined. So again, this doesn't promote your viewpoint.
So this is not a very careful reading, because what that text is doing is assessing penalties should someone accidentally and without the consent of the pregnant person terminate their pregnancy. And the argument here seems to be that that consequence should be assumed to be identical to the consequence should the pregnant person themselves decide to terminate their own pregnancy. But that doesn't make sense. Even today, in places where abortion is legal, if someone causes a woman to terminate her pregnancy against her will and without her consent, there are criminal penalties that are not assessed if the person decides to terminate their own pregnancy. But we don't know for sure what their exact position was. This is why I've always maintained the Bible does not have a position on abortion. All I have argued is that the Bible does take a stance on certain constituent elements of the debate about abortion. And this text here is relevant because what it demonstrates is that a fetus was not considered to be a full legal and moral person. In fact, according to the penalties that are assessed, we have to conclude that a fetus was considered more property than person, and specifically considered the property of the husband, because the husband is the one who determines the fine that is going to be imposed. And then there is arbitration there to ensure that it is not exorbitant, because there is no socially standardized value placed on a fetus as a piece of property. There is for an enslaved person, there's not for a fetus. So it's even more property than an enslaved person.
Now, Mark 5:25 was probably the weirdest text that you brought forward, because all it says is that the woman bled for 12 years. And I'm not too sure what your rhetorical goal is here, because I read the surrounding context and I just don't get it. Maybe you're saying that she chose to touch Jesus's robes and get healed, so therefore she has the choice to kill her own child, which I'm not sure how you come to that logical conclusion.
I would have to agree here. I don't understand the particular relevance of this passage to this discussion. But to summarize, the Bible does not take a stance on abortion. It certainly does not condemn it as murder. And folks who want to appeal to the Bible to condemn abortion as murder don't really have an exegetical leg to stand on, which is why they're overwhelmingly forced into trying to appeal to passages about God's foreknowledge or about God's oversight of creation as specific manifestations of the belief that full moral and legal personhood began at conception, which is just not supported by the data. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, life is fundamentally constituted by breath until we get to the Greco-Roman period, at which point Greek philosophy intervenes and we have differing opinions about when human personhood begins. And we only see this in the Septuagint and in early Christian literature. It doesn't really bubble to the surface of the New Testament itself. So it is really only an extra biblical text that we see this debate going on. And while the earliest Christians sided with the Epicurean/Pythagorean idea about personhood beginning at conception, that would shift by the 5th century to Augustine's view, which would become the consensus view for the majority of Christianity, that life and personhood began at the quickening, and that would be the consensus view until the 19th century. And the fit for this video has been Aurora Monroe, aka the Goddess Storm.